To get us thinking about water, take a look at this guy. He's a belly flop champion. And the question is, belly flops into water hurt a lot. Is that true? Is that false? Or are you not sure? So this is kind of just funny. Of course, this works a little bit better in the classroom than online, but I thought it would be fun to keep this in here to get us thinking about why belly flops hurt so bad. To uncover the answer to this question, we first need to learn some new words. So the new terms for Chapter 2 are as follows. First, matter. Matter is anything that occupies space and has mass, and it comes in 3 phases. Matter can be a solid, a liquid, or a gas. Another term is elements. Elements are what we find on the periodic table. Here we can see this table of all of the elements. You might see this on the wall in a chemistry classroom. Elements are defined as substances that cannot be broken down into other substances. And there's around 98 found on our planet. This number changes as new elements are discovered, but that's pretty close to what we have on our planet today. And then finally, compounds. Compounds are defined as something being made up of 2 or more different elements. Atoms make up matter. So remember, we learned about the scale of things, atoms into molecules, molecules into organelles, and so on and so forth. Well, it's these atoms that contribute to this matter found on our planet. And as I mentioned previously, it's the periodic table that lists all of the known elements. Some very important ones include hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And notice that when we read the table, we can see the atomic number, the name of the element, the symbol for the element, and the atomic mass number. Now, on your exam, I'm not going to make you calculate these atomic numbers or these atomic mass calculations. We're not going to do that in this class. The human body is made up of OCHN in the majority of the body, and then other stuff making up the rest of the body. So oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. That's O, C, H, and N. And notice that our bodies are mostly oxygen. While we are carbon-based life forms, carbon is not what makes up most of our body. It's oxygen. Here is one atom. And remember that atoms are the smallest piece of an element that still retains the characteristics of that element. And we're going to learn all of the parts that make up this atom. We can see the words on the screen right now. We've got these electrons, then we've got protons, and then finally neutrons. Atoms are composed of these 3 smaller particles, the so-called protons, neutrons, and electrons. This comes from a different textbook, but it does a good job of visually showing us how these are organized. Notice that the protons plus the neutrons are found in a region called the nucleus. We've already seen this word nucleus, right? Remember, the nucleus is an organelle in a eukaryotic cell where we find the DNA. This is not the same type of nucleus. We're not even talking about organelles here. We're talking about little parts of an atom, so much, much smaller. And an atom's nucleus is made up of protons plus neutrons. The electrons, which tend to have negative charge, orbit around the atom. So proton is positive charge, neutron is neutral, and electron is negative charge. Atoms come together to form both molecules and compounds. And the short answer is, how do atoms come together? Chemical bonds. It's through these chemical bonds that we can build these larger molecules and compounds. One way that we can get atoms together is by making a donation, where one atom donates to another. This results in ionic bonds. In an ionic bond, here we can see sodium ion, which is Na+, is going to donate an electron to a chloride ion, which is Cl-. And the resulting compound is sodium chloride, which is table salt. Ionic bonds form compounds, at least as far as we're concerned in this general biology class. Another type of bonds that allows us to get atoms together is a covalent bond. In a covalent bond, we're going to share electrons. So it's not donating an electron, it's an equal sharing for the most part. Covalent bonds therefore form molecules, and covalent bonds are strong. They're very hard to break as compared to an ionic bond. A third type of bond that we need to know is a hydrogen bond. And these hydrogen bonds are where we have charged areas being attracted to each other. Here we can see negative and positive charges are attracted, connecting these water molecules together. Now, in a water molecule, we have several different bonds. One of those bonds is a polar covalent bond. So we've already learned about polar, right? This polarity means that it likes water. And we're talking about water. So it makes sense that water would have a polar covalent bond. But what about this covalent word? Remember that. We learned about that. In covalent, we're going to be sharing electrons, so it's very strong. And here we can see oxygen and hydrogen are sharing electrons, so it's very strong and very hard to break that H2O molecule structure. Now, part of this polar nature of water is that it's slightly positive on one end and it's slightly negative on the other end of this molecule. Now, in addition to this very strong polar covalent bond, we also have a hydrogen bond. And these hydrogen bonds are relatively weak compared to a strong polar covalent bond. But this is how the individual water molecules stick together. This is what holds a body of water together. This is why when we do a belly flop, it hurts. But when we do a belly flop, it doesn't kill us, right? It's not like you do a belly flop onto the hard cement or the hard floor. The hydrogen bonds do break from the impact of our body, but it causes us some pain in the process. The polar covalent bond does not break. It's too strong to break just from a belly flop. So now you should be able to describe why does it hurt to do a belly flop and which bonds break when you jump into a swimming pool. Now we're going to learn the properties of water because water is special. The first property is it sticks together, and this is what we call cohesion. We know that water molecules form these relatively weak hydrogen bonds, but it's strong enough to hold the entire ocean together, right? That huge body of water. But it's also how water is able to move up through special types of cells in trees, up to those leaves, hundreds of feet high up in the air. Cohesion is also why this little insect can float on the surface of the water, striding along the surface. Our next property of water is a solvent. And solvents are what dissolve solutes. That is to say, solutes dissolve into solvents. Now we've talked about NaCl, table salt, that sodium chloride. It's a compound, right? It's formed as an ionic bond between sodium and chloride. Sodium donates an electron, but that's easy to break in the presence of water. water breaks apart that bond. Water dissolves hydrophilic solutes. Let's look at the root words. Hydro means water and philic means loving. So that means these are solutes that love water, that are attracted to water, and therefore dissolve in water. Examples of hydrophilic solutes are things like sugar or salt, which we refer to as polar solutes, or ions, things like Na plus or Cl minus, electrolytes like potassium or calcium. These are charged ionic substances. The polarity of water molecules is what helps water dissolve these ions. And here we can see in this figure, we're pouring salt into a beaker of water, and that NaCl is dissolving in water, the universal solvent. The slight negative charge on water attracts the positive charges, such as Na+. And the slight positive charge on water attracts the negative charges, or the chloride ion, which is Cl-. Remember, opposites attract. Water does not dissolve hydrophobic solutes. So hydro means water, and phobic means fearing. So hydrophobic solutes are things such as fats, which are non-polar molecules. And our diagram here shows us a stick of butter, right? Butter is a fat, and that fat doesn't dissolve in water. When you take oil and water and mix it together, you can shake it up, and it might initially mix together, but then it'll separate into two distinct layers of oil and water. Our next property of water that makes it special is water resists temperature change. When you put a pot of water on the stove and you turn it on high, does it boil immediately? No, it takes time. It takes a while to raise that temperature of water to the boiling point. And this property of water is so important for regulating the temperature of our body. That's why we sweat. When we get all sweaty like this guy who's extremely muscular, right? He gets really buff, he gets all sweaty, and that cools the body down. But it also regulates the temperature of our planet. It's all about evaporative cooling. Water expands when it freezes. This is our next property of water that makes it special. When you put water into the fridge or the freezer and you get it nice and cold, you can make ice cubes. And this ice is less dense than water because it's all about a repositioning of those hydrogen bonds. This is very important at the ecosystem level because in places where it gets really freezing cold, the top layer of the water freezes into ice, but aquatic life can survive the winter below the ice in the water below. Finally, water participates in most of life's chemical reactions. Chemical reactions are defined as when two or more molecules, which are the reactants, exchange their atoms, resulting in different molecules, which are the products. And water is almost always needed for these chemical reactions to proceed in most living things. Two very important metabolic reactions that require water includes photosynthesis and respiration. And we're going to spend an entire lecture learning all the steps of photosynthesis and respiration later on in the semester. Life on Earth began in the water and evolved for 3 billion years. This water is therefore essential for most living things that evolved in this watery environment. Evidence of this importance can be seen in modern-day cells. Cells contain anywhere from 70 to 90% water, and this water is an essential part of keeping those cells alive. Here's our question to help us make sure we understand the properties of water. Here's just one of those things I just talked about. Which property contributes to the high surface tension of water? The first choice is hydrogen bonding. The next choice is polar covalent bonds. The next choice is cohesion. The next choice is polar covalent bonds and cohesion. So both of these would be correct. Or the final choice is all of the above are correct. So pause the lecture if you don't want to see the answer yet. All of the above is correct. Hydrogen bonding, polar covalent bonds, and cohesion all contribute to the high surface tension of water. This is what holds water together. So in review, for biology class, we need to know these three bonds. Ionic bonds involve electrons being donated. Ionic bonds that we deal with are soluble in water. Covalent bonds involves electrons shared, but these sharing can be either equal or unequal. Of the bonds we learn, covalent bonds are the strongest. And then finally, hydrogen bonds. This is the attraction between charged atoms. Hydrogen bonds are individually weak, but they're strong in high numbers, as evidenced by the pain you feel when you do a belly flop. So to make sure we understand this, let's take a look at this question. Which figure below, figure A or figure B, shows a water molecule after a belly flop has occurred? So in figure A, it shows us oxygen and hydrogen, and the bond that connects the oxygen and the hydrogen together has been broken. In figure B, the water molecule is intact, or the last choice is neither of these is correct. All right, so let's see what you think. If you don't want to see the answer, please pause the lecture right now. The answer is B. After a belly flop, the water molecule looks exactly the same because that polar covalent bond does not break. All that breaks are those relatively weak hydrogen bonds that hold all of the water molecules together. Using your understanding of chemical bonds, make sure that you can explain why belly flops hurt so much. Be sure to draw the arrangement of these water molecules on the surface of a pool both before and after the belly flop. And here's a picture of the world belly flop champion from a few years ago, because believe it or not, doing belly flops is a sport for some people. The next section that we're going to discuss is all about acids and bases. And the figure on your screen shows the pH scale. The pH scale is based on the amount of hydrogen ions in a solution. And remember, H is hydrogen and plus means it's charged, so it's an ion. A hydrogen ion is stripped of its electron and therefore is also a proton. So H plus and proton can be used synonymously. Acidic solutions have a low pH and a relatively high H plus concentration, or hydrogen ion concentration. Examples of strong acids would have a 0 or a 1 or a 2. See the lemons, they are there on the scale between 1 and 2 for their acidity. Basic solutions have a high pH and a low hydrogen ion concentration. Instead, bases have more hydroxide ions, which are represented by OH minus. They have more hydroxide ions than they do hydrogen ions. And remember, hydrogen ions are protons. If an organism strays too far from its optimal pH, it could die. Buffer solutions help organisms maintain a constant pH by consuming or releasing hydrogen ions. Here's a diagram that shows how atmospheric carbon dioxide has been recorded on our planet for the last 50 years or so. So since about the 1960s, we've had a monitoring station on an island in Hawaii where we've been measuring the concentration of carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere. And notice it's been going up. We're going to talk a lot more about this as the semester goes on and the human activities that have contributed this carbon dioxide to our atmosphere. Why do we care about atmospheric carbon dioxide? Well, it can affect ocean pH. So when we mix water with carbon dioxide, we get a weak acid called carbonic acid. And some of this carbon dioxide ends up going into the oceans, and it gets dissolved into the water of the ocean. In this graph on your screen, we can see that as atmospheric carbon dioxide goes up, and all of these different lines just represent different scientific models for how much carbon dioxide scientists believe will be in the atmosphere in the decades to come. And then it correlates with global ocean pH, and that's going down. Not by much though, right? We're going from just below 8 to about 7.8, so just a 0.2 change on the pH, but it can be catastrophic for life as we know it. This shows us a healthy reef, and then we slightly increase the carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million, and you can see that as soon as we get to over 500 parts per million, the reef is completely dead. It's a wasteland. And at the same time, the temperature's been going up as well, because we're going to learn that carbon dioxide in the air also is directly linked to climate change. Here's our final challenge question from the first part of Chapter 2 that I'm lecturing on. And the challenge question is, molecules and cells can both be found in our bodies, and they are about the same size. So do you agree or do you disagree? So if you don't want to see the answer, then pause your lecture. Here we go. Disagree. So to give us an example or a context for this, a little BB from a BB gun would be an atom. A marble would be a small molecule, and a house cat would be a large molecule. A cell would be the size of a cruise ship. You can imagine how many cats fit on a cruise ship. That's a lot of house cats. Therefore, it takes a lot of molecules just to make one cell. In this next part of our lecture, we're going to look at the main types of molecules that living things are made of. Now, there's inorganic things, such as water, which is H2O, or salt, which is NaCl. These are not organic molecules, but they are very important for living things to function. The other type of molecule that's important for living things to function is the organic carbon-based molecules. For this, we're going to look at carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Before we do so, let's take a look at some foods. And you can even do this as a little quiz if you want, but I give you the answers right away. An avocado contains which of the following organic molecules? Circle all that apply. Well, if you were taking this assessment in the classroom, you would need to circle all 4. Avocados are about 6% carbs, 45% fat, 8% proteins, and yes, there's nucleic acids, because nucleic acids are going to be associated with DNA, and living things have DNA. A can of Coke has which of the following? Now, if you were taking this assessment in a classroom, you would only circle carbs, because a can of Coke has sugars, water, and chemicals. There's no fat, there's no protein, and there's no living cells, so there's no nucleic acids. Now you might say, if I drink 10 cans of Coke, I'm going to get fat, right? But it doesn't have fat. It has sugars. A baked potato contains which of the following organic molecules? Again, you have to circle all of them. It's got carbs, a little bit of fat, proteins, and yes, nucleic acids. And a steak contains which of the following organic molecules? For this one, we just circle fats and proteins and nucleic acids. Now, there are small portions of carbs in muscle, but for the purposes of nutrition, these are not included in these percentages. Here's a pre-assessment question to get us thinking before we launch into this next section of Chapter 2. Hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, and oxygen account for over 96% of the human body. These elements are also the main elements in most organic molecules. The next choice is rare in non-human organisms. The next choice is rare on Earth. The next choice is always bonded by hydrogen bonds. And the final choice is both also the main elements in most organic molecules and always bonded by hydrogen bonds are correct. So pause if you want to wait to think about this for a moment before I reveal the answer. A is the only correct answer. Hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, and oxygen account for 96% of the human body because these elements are also the main elements in most organic molecules, and most of what makes up the human body includes these organic molecules that are so important for the functioning of our cells. Now remember that the human body is mostly made up of oxygen, right? Oxygen is not organic, but when we combine oxygen, carbon, hydrogen together, then we can make an organic molecule. The most simple organic molecule is methane. Organic molecules, by definition, are those molecules that contain both carbon and hydrogen. Now, in order to take these molecules and build larger molecules, we're going to stack them together in the same way that we play with Legos, right? We've got these little Legos that we stick together to build larger structures. Many biological molecules stack or connect to form large molecules. Monomers are the small molecules or building blocks that we find to build larger molecules, which are called polymers. Polymers would be all of the Legos that are combined together. And how do we combine these together? Through special chemical reactions. The first chemical reaction is called dehydration synthesis. During dehydration synthesis, an enzyme binds two monomers, thus releasing a water molecule. This is how we can take those little Legos together, connect them to form a larger structure. Hydrolysis is the reverse reaction of dehydration synthesis. During hydrolysis, we're going to break these polymers down into their smaller monomers. Let's start with our first group of organic molecules, the carbohydrates. As we go through all these groups of organic molecules, we're going to learn that it's truly all about the shape. The monomer for the carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. Monosaccharides are simple sugars. And there's two types of simple sugars, both glucose and fructose. Both of them have the same chemical formula, C6H12O6. But they're slightly different. If we study both of these diagrams, we can see that the way that those elements are arranged are slightly different. There's slightly different bonds that form, but at the end of the day, they still have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens in both glucose and fructose. Now, these simple sugars are the main fuel for cellular work, and later on in another lecture, we're going to learn how cells work. The monosaccharides taste sweet, and they're soluble in water. Now, whenever things are soluble in water, we're going to see this blue drop on the screen, so that tells us that they will dissolve in water, the universal solvent. Many of you might enjoy honey as a sweetener in your foods, and honey is a mix of glucose and fructose monosaccharides. Next, the carbohydrate polymer is called a polysaccharide. And 3 types of polysaccharides that we need to know include starch, cellulose, and glycogen. Now, in addition, we've got a disaccharide. And I kind of throw this in here because di means 2, saccharide is sugar. So this is basically the most simple type of polysaccharide, but we put it in its own category and call it a disaccharide. Polysaccharides are what we really want to focus on here. Our starch, our cellulose, and our glycogen. Starch is the main way that plants store their sugars in their cells. Glycogen is the main way that animals store sugars in their cells. And cellulose is a polysaccharide that makes up plant cell walls. And the cell wall we're going to learn later on in our cell lecture is that special layer that surrounds our plant cell and gives it shape. All of these polysaccharides are soluble in water. Now, disaccharides, remember that's di means 2, saccharide means sugar. Disaccharides are sucrose. It's simply a glucose bonded to a fructose. And we get this table sugar from 2 different types of plants, either sugar cane in tropical regions or from sugar beets in temperate regions. The average American consumes a ton of this sucrose. In fact, most people consume about 140 pounds per year. That's a lot of sugar. Now we can move on to our second group of organic molecules, which are the lipids. The first type of lipid we're going to discuss is called a fat. And notice I put the word monomers in quotation marks because these aren't truly monomers in the way that we've just defined them. These monomers are these building blocks that we link up in a row. Well, fats are more complicated than that. But fats are still made up of building blocks, even though we can't call them true monomers. The building blocks of a fat include fatty acids and glycerol. Glycerol is a sugar alcohol. That's the sugar backbone that holds this together. Notice it's C's and H's and O's. We've seen those before, right? C6H12O6, that was a monosaccharide. And then fatty acids, you can see the shape is slightly different. One fatty acid is a long chain, and the other fatty acid has a bend in it. Saturated and unsaturated fatty acids are the two types that make up a typical fat. When we combine these together, we build one fat molecule, and that fat molecule is called a triglyceride. Tri means 3, and then glyceride. Remember, the glycerol was that sugar alcohol backbone, so we can see the root word is contained within this fat name. And notice that the fat molecule is 2 of these saturated fatty acids and 1 unsaturated fatty acid. Now, you might have heard that a diet in high saturated fats can lead to heart disease. And that can be part of what contributes to heart disease, but there's been new evidence that it's much more than just saturated fats in our diet that contribute to that heart disease. And before I forget, notice the water drop. We've got an X through it. So that tells us that fats are not soluble in water. Now, before we talk more about saturated fats contributing to heart disease, let's talk about trans fatty acids. So trans fat is very bad for you, and this is absolutely scientifically shown that trans fats in your diet can contribute to heart disease. How do we make a trans fat? Well, we take a perfectly healthy unsaturated fat and we convert it to a saturated fat by a hydrogenation reaction. Why do we do this? Well, unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temp. Think about a olive oil bottle. That oil is liquid because it's mostly unsaturated fat. Saturated fats, like butter, are hard at room temp. Or think about some type of shortening like Crisco. That is hard at room temp because it's saturated. So food producers might want to take these unsaturated fats and convert them into saturated to hold their processed foods together. Now, there's been some new evidence that's just been published in the past few years that saturated fats do not contribute directly to heart disease on their own. In fact, many nutrition books will have to be rewritten because this link between saturated fat and heart disease has really been shown to be not scientifically accurate. And there's a link here to the article so that you can check it out online. One of the main reasons that we came to this conclusion was based on a case study of native Greenlanders who depend heavily on a diet of animals such as this seal. And before Western cultures came in and brought their processed foods, these native Greenlanders had almost no heart disease in their population, but they ate a ton of saturated fat. These seals have a ton of saturated fat in their blubber. And so really, the bigger culprit that contributes to heart disease is sugar. And a lot of evidence has been shown that sugar is much more damaging to your health than fat. But of course, the take-home message is moderation. All foods in moderation for ultimate health. So let's say that you have plaque building up in your blood vessels. This is what can directly link you to risk for coronary artery disease. Coronary artery disease can lead to angina, which is chest discomfort, or eventually a heart attack or even heart failure. And a big part of this plaque can come from the foods that we eat. One of the main ways to reduce your risk for heart disease is to quit smoking right away. if you are an individual that smokes cigarettes. If you want to have an example for how these plaque molecules can build up in the vessels, take a look at this YouTube video on your own at home. Another type of lipid, so these are not fats, but they are another type of hydrophobic lipid, are called steroids. And you've probably heard of steroids before. Here's two different types of steroids, both hormones and cholesterol. Hormones are essential for signals in the body. We have hormones in the human body, but plants have hormones as well. Many different types of organisms need these hormones in order to function correctly. Another type of steroid is cholesterol, and cholesterol is only found in animal cell membranes. So whenever you see a food that says cholesterol-free and it's a plant-based food, you can say, well, I know, of course, there's no cholesterol in plant foods. It's just marketing. Now, you might have also heard that there are some types of celebrities and athletes that take steroids. These synthetic anabolic steroids are variants on testosterone, which is a type of hormone. These synthetic steroids help you build up muscle very quickly, but they cause serious health risks. Our third group of organic molecules are the proteins. The protein monomer is an amino acid, and these amino acids come in several different flavors. We don't have to memorize the 20 names of these different flavors, but just know that there's 20 different protein monomers that can be arranged in different orders to give us the protein polymer, which is a polypeptide. This growing polypeptide is simply a chain of amino acids. Proteins are both soluble and insoluble in water, depending on the chemical structure of the protein. Polypeptides get folded to become proteins. So one single polypeptide is not a functional protein. Instead, once it coils into its unique shape, then the protein takes on the characteristics that it needs to get work done inside that cell. Now, it's a special type of covalent bond that connects the amino acids together. It's a special type of bond called a peptide bond. But then between the amino acids, this way, if you look on your screen, you can see I'm moving my mouse to show we're moving this way, hydrogen bonds form, and that is what causes our protein to spontaneously twist into a functional three-dimensional shape. And if that protein does not form the correct shape, it will not be functional. It will essentially be a useless protein that won't get any work done. Why are proteins important? Well, most of our body's structure is in protein, and most of the chemical reactions in our body are done in proteins. Without proteins, we would not be able to function at all. And enzymes are one of the most important groups of proteins. We're going to spend some time later in the semester talking about all the details about how enzymes help cells to get work done efficiently. As a case in point, here is one type of amino acid called tryptophan. And you might have heard that if you eat a big meal, for example, here's a family eating turkey at the holidays, after your meal you get sleepy. But in reality, no, eating turkey doesn't make you sleepy, at least not because of tryptophan. So tryptophan is associated with serotonin production, and serotonin makes us happy or sleepy or relaxed. However, when we eat tryptophan, it doesn't get into our brain very easily. The stomach-to-brain connection isn't very useful for tryptophan. So if you get sleepy after a big turkey dinner, it's just because you ate too much food. Another example, here's a chunk of space rock called a meteorite. And when scientists analyze this meteorite, they find amino acids and nitrogenous bases that were not from Earth. Now, there wasn't enough of amino acids or nitrogenous bases to actually make anything, but it is possible evidence that, well, if we find these strange amino acids elsewhere in the universe, then perhaps life is possible on other planets. And our fourth and final group of organic molecules are the nucleic acids. Nucleic acid monomers include both the nucleotides, and these nucleotides come in several flavors. They come in the A, the C, the G, and the T/U. And this is a little bit confusing. What is this whole T/U? Well, the DNA nucleotides includes A, C, G, and T. But the RNA nucleotides includes A, C, G, and U. That is to say, RNA substitutes U for the T. When we combine these monomers together, we form the nucleic acid polymer. And these polymers are DNA or RNA strands. And we're going to spend a lot of time later in the semester learning all the properties of DNA. So I'm going to go very quickly through this for now. We're just going to learn the very basics and then explore it in greater detail later in the semester. Nucleic acids are soluble in water. DNA forms what's called a double helix structure because it's composed of two strands, and these strands have complementary bases that form hydrogen bonds. It's all about the rules of pairing. We can see here that A pairs with T and C pairs with G. Based upon this pairing rules, we form this double helix. And we're going to learn the implications for why this is important when we explore all the details for how DNA works later in the semester. Also notice that the nucleotides are attached to a backbone, and that backbone is called the sugar phosphate backbone. How does RNA different from DNA? Well, it's all about the sugar. RNA has a different structure to the sugar that makes up part of this molecule. I also mentioned that it has that different nitrogenous base. It has U, which we call uracil, instead of T, which is thymine. And again, we're going to learn all these names and all of these parts when we do our DNA lecture later on. I do want to show you, though, overall, this is the flow of genetic information. We take DNA, and then we convert that language into RNA, and then we take that language and we use it to build our protein. Remember, these proteins are these strings of amino acids that spontaneously form into a three-dimensional shape. All right, we're going to end this Chapter 2 lecture with a little quiz that's all about one type of organic molecule. So first off, based upon what you see on the screen, what type of molecule is this? Is it a carb, a lipid, a nucleic acid, or a protein? It's a protein. What are its building blocks? Are proteins made up of amino acids, or nucleotides, or fatty acids, or glucose? The answer is amino acids. What types of bonds will primarily determine its shape? Is it made up of covalent, hydrogen, or ionic bonds to give it that three-dimensional shape? The answer is hydrogen bonds. Remember, it's those hydrogen bonds that cause that long string of amino acids That's called a polypeptide to spontaneously form into that three-dimensional shape. And then finally, what would happen if this protein folded up wrong? Nothing. It still works fine. The next answer is it becomes a lipid. And the final answer is it becomes non-functional. Which one is correct? It becomes non-functional. If proteins misfold, then they don't work. Finally, you can print this chart out if you'd like and fill out the table and use it as a tool to help learn all of the major components of the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. In addition, I give you the answers here on your screen, and I give you one final table to help you organize your thoughts when you're studying for our exam.